Hello. I am very happy to be here and honored to be amongst you.
That's the extent of my French. I'm not going to embarrass myself any further. And it's my first time in Bordeaux, beautiful city, thrilled to be here. I did learn something very important at dinner last night, which is that when you order your dozen delicious oysters from the Bassin d'Arcachon, and you ask for dry white wine, you do not get Chablis. Nor should you. So just a word or two about myself and my firm. I run a consultancy called Giant Steps Media Technology Strategies based in that hellhole that Bill McCoy mentioned, Midtown Manhattan. And we work at sort of the intersection of technology, copyright law, and business strategy. And I've been working on this LCP initiative for a few years now, as I'll explain. And what I'm hoping to do this morning is to introduce many of you to LCP. You've heard the term mentioned a couple times this morning. Tell you what it is, what we're doing with it, where it fits in the ecosystem, and so forth. It's been a pleasure working with Laurent at EDRLab and Pierre and the other people involved, Bill, of course, McCoy, Rick, and all the others involved in this initiative. So I'm not sure why we don't have can you do something with that, perhaps?
Let's try.
Okay. Okay, so let's see here. Right. So the purpose of Readium LCP, which is Readium Licensed Content Protection, is we need DRM to protect, not only to protect content from certain types of, as Bill McCoy likes to say, oversharing, but also to make possible the implementation of certain content access models. Retail is an obvious one. There are a lot of membership organizations that provide content to their members at no specific charge, but as a membership benefit. That's a big use of it. E-textbooks, when you have a reader who, let's face it, is really not thrilled about paying for the content at all, but needs to obtain it. And has to obtain it legitimately. Library lending, we've discussed. Subscription services also. These are all different access models that benefit from the use of some sort of content protection technology. But at the same time, there's been a need for a long time for standards in DRM to ensure that we get an interoperable experience across devices and types of and modes of reading. The current ebook market is fragmented, and each of the leading retailers, or many of the leading retailers, have their own DRMs, and some of them even use ePUB, but they have their own DRMs for ePUB, such as Apple for iBooks. Of course, Amazon has its own DRM. Kobo now has its own DRM. Barnes & Noble over in the United States and UK and maybe one or two other places has its own DRM. And then there are also a number of independent DRMs that exist out there, probably the best known of which is Adobe Content Server from Adobe. But there are others. There's a DRM called VitalBooks from a company called VitalBooks, which is used fairly extensively in the e-textbook community. A newer entrant in this field is called Marlin from Intertrust, and Sony is marketing a solution based on Marlin. Fasu is a Korean vendor that's very active in that geography and elsewhere. Mark Any is another Korean vendor that has a DRM that's used in the ebook space, and these are just a few examples. So the genesis of this initiative was, as Laurent, I think, mentioned in 2012, within the auspices of the IDPF, and it evolved, among other places, from conversations that I had had with Bill McCoy around that time about the need for an interoperable DRM standard associated with ePUB in some way. And so this initiative started out within the IDPF. It migrated to the Readium Foundation and subsequently has found a home within EDRLab as the entity that's really working to launch this technology to the market, and I'll describe shortly what that actually means. So the ePUB 2 standard did not encompass DRM, and that has led to fragmentation, as I mentioned. And there are third-party DRMs, as I mentioned, and in addition to the lack of interoperability, there have been certain other sort of market-based issues with those DRMs. One is that they cost implementers to implement. They are a burden of cost and complexity on implementers. There have been cases where the vendors of these technologies have been unstable, or they have shown lack of commitment to the market and have reduced confidence in their offerings. They are often complex to implement. They require a lot of development effort and so forth. So what we're trying to accomplish here is as follows. We're trying to bring out a DRM for use with the Readium reading system software that's simple and low in cost, that enables a seamless, friction-free reading experience, as close to DRM-free type of reading experience as possible, enabling offline reading, not requiring what we call phoning home, which means an internet connection just to be able to open an ebook or document whenever you want to read it, to enable interoperability among ePUB 3 reading systems, while also, as Rick Wright mentioned, enabling other DRMs to be used with Readium-based e-reading systems, minimizing walled gardens or silos, as they are called. To support the primary content access models, permanent distribution, whether you're selling or giving away content, time-based distribution, which includes library lending, subscription services, anything with a time limit on it, and also, and very importantly, accessibility for the print disabled. These are the access models that we have in mind. There are more complex and esoteric access models that are not in scope for LCP, but may be implemented by other DRMs that will work with Readium. So that's all by design to keep it simple, to make sure that it's easy and as cheap as possible for app developers and distributors to implement. In terms of how secure this will be, it's hard to measure the relative hardness of security of DRMs, but the general idea that we have is to make the security level comparable to the commercial DRMs that are out there now, so that publishers of content can be comfortable with the level of security. And a major objective that we've had is to eliminate the dependency on commercial vendors for any aspect of this technology. So there are a few components of the technology, and I'm just going to go down this list quickly. Anyone who wants further detail, I'd be very happy to talk to them during breaks and during the remainder of this conference at this amazing bookstore where we are. I wish my French were better so that I could spend lots and lots of time browsing and buying in this bookstore. Anyway, here are the components. There's a specification. There's something called an encryption profile, which is a set of details about how the cryptographical functions work in the system, including certain key materials and so forth. There is open source code for client and server side. There are license agreements, which are legal documents for client implementers and server implementers separately. And then there's something that I'll talk about in a moment called robustness rules. So some of you are familiar with DRM may wonder, how can you have a DRM that's open source? How can you have open source code? Well, first of all, there's the code, and then separately there's what we call the interoperable ecosystem. It's open source code. Anyone will be able to take it, modify it, et cetera, whatever's allowed through the open source license. But not anyone can join our LCP interoperable ecosystem. There are other things required besides the code to join the ecosystem. Those are keys that you need to get from EDRLab that you have to keep secret, that you're obligated by a license agreement to keep secret. Digital certificates, same thing. They're cryptographic material that you're required to maintain and to have in order to participate. You need to pass a series of compliance tests, which test how that you're compliant with the specification. And then finally, you need to certify that you are in compliance with what are called robustness rules. So let's see. Right, so I do talk about robustness rules later. Here are the elements of the security of the system. It's based on a standard encryption algorithm called AES, which is used very widely in U.S. government, in DRMs everywhere. It happens to be a U.S. government standard. It's considered to be uncrackable. There's a passphrase that is either chosen by the user or assigned by the ebook distributor, depending on the model. There are license status documents, which are small files that tell you, that contain the encryption keys and tell you what rights you have to a certain document, like you have the right to read this until the end of the month or indefinitely or whatever the case may be. And then there are digital certificates, which are identifiers of distributors. They're issued by a trusted third party called a certificate authority, and they essentially establish and vouch for the identity of a distributor. So let's talk once more about what it means to have an open source DRM. This is something that has been attempted at a few times over the past 10 plus years, frankly without much success because it was sort of attempted in a vacuum. So what does it mean to hack a DRM or crack a DRM? It means either that you find the unencrypted content on the device and then you've got the unencrypted content, or you find the keys that enable you to unlock the document because you know what the algorithm is. It's a published algorithm. AES is a published algorithm. So you need to make it harder to do either of those things. So what you can do is you can apply what are called robustness techniques or hardening techniques, such as obfuscating the code, which means making the compiled code that runs on your device not map very easily to the source code. And so it's hard to reverse engineer. Another thing that you can do is you can install what are called guards, which are pieces of software that detect suspicious activity like attempts to reverse engineer, attempts to run debuggers, and so forth. There are various other things that you can do to code so that if you know the source code, it isn't very much help in hacking the system. And similarly, it's like if you know the algorithm but you don't know the keys, then you haven't gotten very far in cracking a system. It's an analogous situation. So robustness rules are parts of license agreements that a client implementer has to agree to that say, I agree to make my code hardened according to these specific rules so that someone who knows the source code doesn't get much help from that source code in hacking the system. Does this mean that LCP implementations are going to be 100% hack-proof? No. There is no such thing as a hack-proof DRM. It does not exist. It's all relative, right? We're trying to maintain a reasonable level of security that is comparable to things that are out there on the market now. So, with regard to interoperability is, of course, very important. Trying to establish cross-device, cross-reading system interoperability. You need a passphrase to open up your file. The objective is that any compliant reading system with LCP will open that file given the passphrase. And then the reading system will observe whatever rights are defined on the file, such as time limits or text-to-speech conversion. So, we are building this license program, or what we call a logo program. So you can put a logo on your app material or your server material that says this is compliant, it's certified. We have yet to come up with the specific language, but basically this gives you membership in the LCP interoperable ecosystem. You need to sign a license agreement, pass compliance tests. You get access to that encryption profile, which is a confidential set of material. You agree to comply with robustness rules. In many cases, you will self-certify that you have complied with the robustness rules. In some cases, publishers may require that you submit your implementation to a third-party audit, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And for all this, there will be a fee that you will pay, which is basically to recover the costs of running this infrastructure. EDRLab is the license authority for this scheme, and I'm working with Laurent at the moment about defining what those fees are, but I can guarantee you that they will be considerably lower than what commercial DRM vendors charge for their technologies. That's a core objective. We do have an objective, as I said, of removing vendor dependencies from this scheme. In addition to being open source, we want not to rely on any commercial vendors that may go out of business, decide they're not interested in this model anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, EDRLab is what we call the license authority. They handle the licensing, handle the administration of compliance tests. They supply the keys, perhaps through third parties, but they supply the key material. We are working with a company called Cartesian, which is consulting to us on the development of the robustness rules, and they're very experienced with this. They come out of the world of pay television, where security is a very, very tough requirement. And they will be available for auditing as third-party auditors when and if those occasions arise once this thing is launched. The other third party that we need is a trusted certificate authority to issue the digital certificates. And so we have gone straight, as we say over in America, to the horse's mouth on this. We went to the standards body that defines the standard X.509 being used for these digital certificates, the International Telecommunications Union, which, as some of you know, is a major global standards body, and we are negotiating with them now, or Laurent is negotiating with them, I'm just helping, to become the certificate authority as an alternative to relying on a commercial certificate authority, of which many exist in the world. So, right now there are GitHub repositories. There are there's a handful of companies that are contributing the open source code. The GitHub repositories are currently private. They will be made public at a suitable time, and that expectation is for November, or Laurent said end of year. That's roughly what we're talking about right now. I'd like to particularly mention DRM Inside from Korea that has contributed client code, T from here in France that's contributed client code, and De Marque, which is a French-Canadian company contributing code on the server side, and Montano as well, right, from France. There are a lot of other companies that are implementing this or have committed to implementing it, and you can see that although we're heavy on France, here there are entities from across the world. The New York Public Library, my neighbor in Midtown Manhattan, one of my favorite places in Midtown Manhattan, Learning Ally in the United States, and the others that you can read here on this slide. So that's pretty much where we are with LCP, and hopefully that gives a good introduction to everyone here. And once again, I will be around today and tomorrow if anyone would like to discuss further. Do we have time for some questions now? We do. So I'd be glad to take some questions, and I'll put my earphone on in case they're in French.
Don't bet on that. So I have a question. The specification itself is behind walled gardens.
No, it's publicly available.
Where? Can you point it?
I don't
give us
remember
a
the
URL,
URL
because-
offhand, but Laurent has that.
We've been waiting for that for a very long time, really long time.
Quick answer. It's in a Google Doc that is, in fact, public for those who have the hyperlink. It's not totally finalized because there is some wording to finalize. This is the only reason why we didn't put it really public with some advertising around it. But we aim at having it public, finalized, with the pricing that we are trying to set up in 1 month, not more.
Well, so the pricing is a separate matter from the spec. I can tell you personally, as an observer of the changes in the spec, that right now they are really, really tiny little changes that are being made.
Yeah, but I would like to make a point. I have a problem with the words released when finalized, because that does not allow us to make comments if it's finalized. You see my point? I mean, if the whole process was behind walls and it's released only when it's finalized, you have no interaction with us about the spec. And I think it's a mistake.
Just, I'm sorry to comment instead of question, but I want to respond to that point, Daniel, which is this is an open source project, not an open standards project. So we may be confused because we hear about specifications, but it's like most open source, it's who comes to the table to build it that's going to determine, what it is. And the stakeholders who come to the table are all contributing resources and actually financially as well, so that we can have people like Bill and these consultants to do the work. This is an industrial project. It's not a pure standards project. If there are people in this room who want to be, intimately involved in it, there's still absolutely time to get involved. See anyone involved in Readium Foundation. That could be me, Micah Bowers, who's also on the board, Adrian Gardu of Feedbooks, anyone involved in Readium. Talk to us about getting involved. There is a DRM steering committee for the Readium Foundation, but it's true that not all the work is going on in GitHub. You can see the GitHub issues and so on, right? It is being developed not behind closed doors, but it's being developed as an industrial project, not by IDPF, a standards organization, or W3C, a standards organization, but by Readium Foundation for the practical use of those adopters. If you want to be one of them, great, let's come talk to us, but don't expect the same norms about transparency with an industrial project as you expect for standards. And it may be confusing since some of us, like me, sit on both sides of that fence. So I apologize for that, but I just wanted to make that key point that all about Readium and specifically the DRM project, it's on a slightly different basis than ePUB itself. Sorry for the long comment.
I think we have someone in the back there.
My turn? OK. Bonjour, Bertrand Levavasseur, Sony DADC. Je représente une entité du groupe Sony spécialisée dans les DRM. Voilà, la question que j'ai à poser est la suivante. Laurent, c'est plus une question pour le EDRLab et pour la communauté. Est-ce qu'une Protect Lite, ça suffit? Est-ce que ça correspond vraiment aux besoins de tous les acteurs du marché? Voilà, c'est une question qu'on peut se poser. Chez Sony, ça fait 15 ans qu'on fait des DRM. On sait que c'est très compliqué de trouver le bon équilibre entre, d'un côté, sécurité, flexibilité pour les ayants droit, et de l'autre côté, interopérabilité et aussi facilité d'accès pour les utilisateurs. Donc avec la petite expérience qu'on a nous chez Sony, on a trouvé une solution. Ça fait longtemps qu'on y travaille. On développe des solutions pour le secteur du jeu vidéo, pour le secteur du cinéma en vidéo, des solutions qui sont largement utilisées, qui sont éprouvées. Et aujourd'hui, on pense pouvoir apporter une brique importante à la communauté avec une solution qui est, vraiment interopérable, qui est vraiment facile à utiliser. Donc on met au centre du jeu l'utilisateur en faisant de sorte que vraiment l'expérience soit optimale et aussi en sauvegardant les intérêts des ayants droit, faisant en sorte que la solution soit très solide, soit aussi très flexible, puisse permettre de promouvoir les contenus comme on le veut, en prêtant les livres et tous les modèles adéquats. Donc voilà, je suis à votre disposition pour en parler. La solution, elle est déjà mise en place ou en cours d'intégration chez Bluefire, chez Demark, chez Datalogix, chez New York Public Library, et je serais ravi d'en parler avec vous. Voilà.
Juste une réponse rapide en deux pans. première chose, avec la casquette Readium, les logiciels Readium ne sont pas mono-DRM. Il est très clair que les logiciels Readium supporteront plusieurs DRM, et on est en train de travailler à une architecture qui le permet. C'est-à-dire qu'un logiciel basé sur Readium pourra prendre un livre protégé par une DRM, prendre un autre livre protégé par une autre DRM, les lire de manière complètement ouverte, du moment que les constructeurs de ces DRM l'auront permis. Ce qui n'est pas tout à fait évident pour tous, mais Sony, c'est une chose. Donc Sony sera supporté par les logiciels Readium. Deuxième petite chose, oui, nous pensons que la solution qu'on est en train de développer, en effet, est interopérable, accessible et sécure. Puisque le light, c'est light pour l'utilisateur, pas light pour les encryptions utilisées. Mais ça, c'est le marché qui le dira. Donc, je ne peux pas en dire plus pour l'instant. Et qui le dit déjà. Via nos partenaires de TI.
Hello. Hello. I think the work that's going on is really interesting. As a reader, I'm somewhat conflicted about DRM anyway, but as a publisher, this looks very, very interesting. The one concern I have around the robustness is we have a situation currently where, and it's been there for a long time, where PDFs can be marked as, say, unprintable, for example. When if you build a PDF in Acrobat, you can say this can't be printed. And if you open that up in Acrobat Reader, it honors that. But you install a dozen other PDF readers that haven't got that flag or support for that flag, and you can print it like normal. You can do that in Chrome, for example. I used to be a teacher in our school. We actually had all of the Linux computers wiped and destroyed because, no, it wasn't my decision, but somebody else decided because they were allowing PDFs to be printed, they were insecure. So anyway, that's a long story, but the question really is, regarding the robustness, how can we be sure that someone doesn't come along and decide to build their own e-reader that just ignores those features that you may, the properties that may be built into the ePUB to say, that there's a time limit, for example, or that it can't be shared, things like that. How can we be assured as publishers?
Right. So that's the difference between the code and the interoperable ecosystem. If being in the interoperable ecosystem gives you access to key material that those who are not in the interoperable ecosystem don't have. So if you have a document that's encrypted with key material that you've gotten as a licensee, as a member of the interoperable ecosystem, then your documents can only be read by reading devices that are within that interoperable ecosystem. Somebody who just has the code can implement a DRM system, but without a provider certificate, without the secret key, you can't decrypt those documents. Now, look, are there going to be hacks to this thing? Yeah. Are there hacks to Adobe Content Server? Absolutely. There are laws in many countries that make hacking DRMs a violation of copyright law. That's the case in the European Union. It's the case in the US. So what that amounts to is that the hacks are a little bit hard to find. But that's basically how the system will work.
Yeah, and I just wonder, though, does that mean then the cost has to be prohibitive to try and put off people who just want to build their own reader that can do this? I mean, I don't have a problem with cost, and I know it hasn't been discussed, but if that's going to be the only kind of firewall, I guess, that stops other people coming in and becoming part of the interoperable ecosystem, is that there's a price of entry. Is that enough? Do we not need to have more procedures, say like the App Store, where you have to be approved to become part of the ecosystem? I know you mentioned audits. Should that not maybe be enforced?
Well, so I mean, that's a very interesting question. It's something that we've debated. There are two sets of things that you need to. You can think of it as being two sets of things. Let's stick for the moment to client implementers. Somebody like Bluefire who wants to implement apps. Compliance rules that you have to pass have to do with compliance with the spec, and that means that anyone who uses your app is guaranteed to have an app that works the way all the other apps do that are Readium LCP compliant, that the functionality is as it's supposed to be. Then there's the robustness compliance. So in a perfect world of security, everyone would be required to have third-party audit, good housekeeping seal of approval on every version of every app for every device that uses LCP. Is that practical? No. What I like to do when I'm evaluating this kind of thing is look to what Hollywood does. Hollywood is the sort of gold standard for strength of security, because when you're spending $200 million on Batman versus Superman, you want to make sure that the piracy of your content is kept, not eliminated, but kept to a minimum. So they tend to care the most about this stuff. And even the Hollywood guys do not require third-party audits of their robustness rules for Hollywood-compliant DRMs such as Microsoft Play Ready and the various pay TV conditional access schemes that are out there. They will only require it in certain specific situations, such as what's known as early window HD content, where the movie just came out and they're making it available over pay television, even though it only just hit the theaters. That's the kind of thing. And so we have to rely on self-certification, except in the cases where the publisher will insist as part of the publisher's licensing agreement with the app developer or service provider that they submit to audits. And that's, as a practical matter, that's how it needs to work, or else it'll just be prohibitively expensive and complex for everybody.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Fernando Pinto
Good
da
morning.
Silva. I'm blind, and I've got a short question for you regarding LCP. We were told about this checkbox, which could disallow or forbid, as you want, the text-to-speech access. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
What about it specifically?
We were told about a checkbox in the LCP process, which could disallow the access of text-to-speech with some reading systems, and which could, so, for instance, totally forbid me the fact to read my book in iOS app, for instance, with LCP. Is it true, or is it something?
Right. So text-to-speech is a right that can be granted to the user or not, just like there can be a right to expire the content or not. And it's ultimately the way text-to-speech works in most, I'm not going to commit to all, but most commercial ebook environments is that it's an option that the publisher sets. So if the publisher doesn't want text-to-speech access, then the publisher specifies that right. It's not up to the distributor or the app developer to specify that. It's basically up to both of those entities to honor whatever the publisher wants. So basically, if there is and this has been a controversial issue, and the ultimate answer has always been, as far as I can tell, if you want to raise a concern about lack of accessibility for the print disabled, you can either hack the DRM or take it up with the publisher. That's what it boils down to. So this is something that publishers have, or some publishers, not all, have requested that be put into the design. Do we have time for more questions? Are there more questions? I think there's Bill Kasdorf has a question up here.
I was first. He was first. I was just, okay.
Okay.
So you referred to the legislation versus hackers a few minutes ago. And there is a pretty heavy discussion happening, which you probably heard about, around W3C and EME and exactly that issue.
Right.
And one of the one of the aspects that emerged in the past few weeks, actually, is what happens to security researcher community that may want to hack in the good sense the system, and whether the various vendors would be willing to accept that they will not pursue these people because they do it for a good cause. Now, let that discussion go there, but what I am wondering about whether it is possible to get something like that into your agreement from the start, that when you have an implementation which works with EDRLab, that those implementers who come to you say in advance that they will not pursue, and there might be some legal text around that, but they will not pursue those people who, for research purposes, try to hack the system, so to say.
That's a really interesting idea. So let me explain a couple of things. First of all, there is an exception to the anti-circumvention law already in U.S. law for encryption research. That is not the case for necessarily for other jurisdictions.
But and what I understood, and I am really not a lawyer, but the current list which is maintained by the Library of Congress does not cover those who work with. So,
yeah, but that's because the encryption, the research exception, is not part of the Library of Congress list. It's part of the statute. They're two different things. The other thing to mention regarding U.S. law, and I'll keep that discussion to a bare minimum because we're not in the United States, is that all that process around DMCA 1201 is being revisited right now by the Copyright Office. There's a study being done right now. The proposals were due a couple weeks ago, I think, or yeah, a couple weeks ago. I haven't read them yet, but my personal opinion is that what you're suggesting is a really good idea. And second of all, we have a lawyer who's working on the license agreements. Jean-Baptiste Souffrant is his name. And I cannot think of a better person on earth to figure out how to do that. This is not a guarantee that it will get done. but I'm just saying that we do have someone who is extremely knowledgeable about all this stuff and how to draft it into an agreement, and can certainly look at that issue. And my personal feeling is that it's a really good idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eh ben, ça c'est vraiment intéressant qu'on puisse discuter.
Well, it's really interesting for us to be able to talk about these issues in a summit like this one. It's really interesting to be able to have this discussion. Mr. Georges has just told me that there's a European directive, which is also a little bit like the US legislation, that will make it possible to provide for something for research centers. So this is a discussion we'll be able to continue.